How avoidants show pain after losing the one who truly cared. You'll never see an avoidant collapse in public. They don't beg, they don't chase, they don't cry where you can see it, but don't be fooled. Their silence isn't peace, it's punishment for themselves. When someone with avoidant tendencies loses the person who truly cared, the outside world doesn't notice much. They seem calm, maybe even relieved. They'll say things like, it's probably for the best, or I just need space to focus on myself. But what's really happening inside is a slow, quiet heartbreak. Because avoidants don't process pain out loud, they process it in isolation. See, deep down, they're not untouched by loss. They're just afraid of what loss brings up. Intimacy, vulnerability, the truth that someone did see them, and they push that person away. At first, they feel powerful for keeping control. But after the silence sets in, the emptiness starts to echo. They replay memories, not the fights, but the moments they were loved despite their walls, and it hits them that person actually cared. And I didn't know how to receive it. Avoidants show pain in subtle ways, in distractions that don't work anymore, in relationships that feel hollow, in moments when they realize no one else cares the same way. Their pain isn't in the explosion. It's in the quiet aftermath. And the cruel irony? By the time they're ready to open up, the one who cared has already healed, learned, and moved on. When an avoidant person loses someone who truly cared, the first thing they reach for isn't comfort, it's control. Control becomes the emotional armor that keeps them feeling safe, composed, and untouched by loss. To everyone else, they look like they've handled the breakup with maturity or indifference. They're calm, practical, even detached. They'll say things like, it's for the best, or I just need time to focus on myself. But those words are a smokescreen, a way to turn a deeply emotional experience into something that sounds logical, manageable, and unemotional. Inside, though, what's really happening is far more complex. Avoidants experience pain just like anyone else. The difference is that they don't allow themselves to feel it in real time. They were often taught, directly or indirectly, that feelings make you weak, that needing someone makes you vulnerable, and that showing emotion gives others power over you. So when the one person who truly cared walks away, their first instinct isn't to cry or grieve, it's to suppress. They tighten their emotional grip. They organize their thoughts, distract themselves with work, hobbies, or new routines, anything to stay in control. Control gives them a sense of stability, but it also distances them from healing, because what they're really doing is managing perception, both yours and their own. They don't want you to see that they're hurting, and they definitely don't want to admit it to themselves. They'll replay the relationship in their mind, not to miss you, but to reassure themselves that detaching was the right choice. They'll focus on moments where they felt overwhelmed or pressured, reminding themselves, see, this is why it didn't work. It's a form of self-soothing that reinforces their independence while keeping pain at arm's length. The irony is that the more they try to control their emotions, the more those emotions control them in subtle ways. The tension doesn't disappear. It just moves underground. They might feel restless, irritated, or strangely empty without being able to explain why. Nights get quieter, and the silence they once craved starts to feel heavy. But admitting that emptiness would mean admitting loss, and loss threatens the image they've built, the one that says they're always fine, always self-sufficient, always in command. You can often see this pattern in how quickly they move on, or at least appear to. They might start dating again, not because they're ready, but because being alone brings up too much discomfort. It's easier to distract than to feel. Or they'll bury themselves in productivity, convincing themselves that success, achievement, or structure can fill the void that connection once did. They'll rewrite the story in their head. They didn't lose something meaningful. They simply chose themselves. It sounds empowering, and in a way it is, but it's also a narrative built on denial. What makes this pattern so painful is that it reinforces the very thing that caused the loss in the first place. The avoidant person wanted closeness, but their fear of vulnerability made it impossible to accept it fully. So when the relationship ends, they double down on the same defense that pushed love away: control. And for a while, it works. They can convince themselves they're better off. They can go weeks or months appearing unbothered. but the illusion always cracks eventually, usually when the distractions stop working or when they meet someone new and realize they can't connect the same way. Underneath the control is grief. Grief for the love they couldn't hold, for the safety they didn't know how to accept, and for the version of themselves that believed shutting down was strength. They don't cry immediately, they don't break down publicly, but their pain seeps out in moments of quiet reflection, in overthinking, in the ache of missed connection. They may even find themselves scrolling through old photos or texts, not to reach out, but to feel something familiar again. Control helps them survive the loss, but it doesn't help them heal from it. It's the emotional equivalent of holding your breath underwater. Impressive for a while, but unsustainable. Eventually, the need to breathe, to feel, to admit that they cared and that they're hurting becomes too strong to ignore. But by then, the one who truly cared is often gone, leaving them alone with the control they fought so hard to keep and the emptiness it can no longer protect them from. When an avoidant person goes quiet after losing someone who truly cared, that silence isn't indifference, it's armor. It's their way of creating distance from emotions that feel too intense, too uncontrollable, too revealing. For them, silence is safety. It's the one thing they can control when everything else feels uncertain. While most people grieve through talking, crying, or reaching out, an avoidant grieves through withdrawal. They don't share their pain. They hide it in the stillness, convincing themselves that solitude will protect them from the chaos of feeling too much. This silence is not a lack of care, but a coping mechanism built over years of self-protection. Somewhere in their story, they learned that expressing pain leads to disappointment or rejection. Maybe they grew up in an environment where vulnerability was ignored or mocked. Maybe they once opened up to someone and it backfired. Whatever the cause, they built a belief system that says, if I stay quiet, I can't get hurt. So when loss hits, they retreat. Not because they don't feel, but because feeling out loud is terrifying. Their silence is often misunderstood. To outsiders, it can look cold, detached, or even cruel. The person who loved them might interpret it as proof that they never cared. But inside, that silence is loud. It's full of thoughts they can't untangle and emotions they can't name. They replay conversations in their head, imagine what they could have said differently, and analyze every memory with surgical precision, all without saying a word. Their mind becomes a battlefield of unspoken emotion. When they withdraw, it's not just from the person they lost, but from themselves. They disconnect from their own feelings to avoid the vulnerability that pain brings. They'll convince themselves that silence equals strength, that not reacting means they're moving on. But what's really happening is emotional suppression. They press pause on their healing, mistaking numbness for peace. It's easier to feel nothing than to feel everything. Still, silence doesn't erase pain, it just delays it. Over time, it starts to leak through the cracks. Maybe they find themselves overthinking late at night, unable to sleep. Maybe they feel a sudden emptiness when something reminds them of the person they lost. The silence that once felt protective begins to feel isolating. The walls they built for safety start to resemble a cage. They might scroll through old messages, but never press send. They might compose a text in their notes app, rewriting it a dozen times, then delete it altogether. Every unsent word is a reminder of what they can't bring themselves to express. What makes this silence so powerful is that it's both a punishment and a refuge. It shields them from emotional exposure, but also traps them in loneliness. It's their way of saying, I can't handle the weight of being seen right now. But underneath that quiet is a longing to be understood without having to explain themselves, to have someone notice their pain without needing them to articulate it. The cruel irony is that the one person who might have understood is no longer there to read between the lines. In their silence, they might appear to move on. They might throw themselves into work, keep busy, and avoid emotional conversations. But the quiet moments between distractions are filled with unspoken words. They think about reaching out, then remind themselves why they shouldn't. Pride mixes with fear, and fear wins. They don't want to look weak or desperate. They tell themselves that silence gives them dignity, but it's really a shield against vulnerability. Even though they seem composed, their silence often hides guilt. They know they pushed away someone who tried to love them. They know their inability to communicate cost them something real. But admitting that would require confronting the very emotions they've spent years avoiding. So they stay quiet, not realizing that silence doesn't protect them from pain. It preserves it. The longer they stay silent, the more that pain embeds itself, turning into regret that lingers quietly beneath their calm exterior. Silence becomes their story, a way to rewrite heartbreak without acknowledging its depth. They'll convince themselves they're fine until something or someone forces them to face what they buried. But until then, the silence remains their language, their shield, and their prison. It's how they show pain without showing it at all. Regret doesn't hit an avoidant all at once. It creeps in slowly, like a shadow that follows them long after they've walked away. In the beginning, they might genuinely believe they've made the right decision. They feel a strange sense of relief, a calm that comes from regaining their space and control. They convince themselves that distance is freedom and that they're finally breathing again after feeling emotionally crowded. On the surface, it looks like they've moved on effortlessly. They return to their routines, reconnect with their independence, and tell themselves that losing someone who cared was just part of life. But deep down, beneath that calm exterior, something starts to shift. It begins with small, unexpected reminders, a scent, a song, a phrase the other person used to say. At first, they brush it off. They tell themselves it's just nostalgia, nothing more. But the memories start to multiply. They remember not just the conflicts or the pressure they once felt, but the comfort of being understood, the warmth of being seen by someone who cared despite their distance. Slowly, the story they told themselves that they were better off begins to unravel. The silence they once found soothing starts to feel empty. Avoidants often mistake peace for numbness. After a breakup, they feel calm not because they've healed, but because they've suppressed their emotions. They shut down their feelings so effectively that they confuse emotional disconnection with clarity. But as time passes and distractions fade, emotions they buried begin to surface. They start to see flashes of what they lost, not through logic, but through longing. It's subtle at first, a thought that lingers a little too long, a moment when they instinctively want to share something with the person who's no longer there. Those moments accumulate until they can't ignore the ache anymore. Regret for an avoidant doesn't sound like a loud apology or an outpouring of guilt. It's quieter, more internal. It's a realization that hits them when no one's watching, when they're alone at night, when they see something that reminds them of how it felt to be cared for without conditions. They start to remember the tenderness they once took for granted. They realize that the person they pushed away didn't want to control them. They just wanted to love them. That truth is hard for them to sit with because it exposes the flaw in their defense, that their fear of losing control made them lose something irreplaceable. The hardest part for avoidance is that regret comes too late. When they finally feel the full weight of what they've lost, the other person has often already healed. By the time they're ready to open up, to talk, to try again, the door has usually closed. That timing creates another layer of pain, not just for the relationship, but for the realization that their own walls cost them the very connection they secretly craved. It's not just the loss of a person, it's the loss of an opportunity to be loved without running away. They start to think about what it would have been like to stay, to try a little harder, to trust a little more. They remember the small gestures, the text that checked in on them, the patience in the other person's voice, the way they felt seen even when they didn't say much. And with each memory, the regret deepens. They realize that what they once perceived as pressure was actually someone trying to get close enough to love them properly. That realization can be devastating because it dismantles the belief that leaving was protection. Instead, it starts to look like self-sabotage. Regret for avoidance isn't about wanting the person back as much as it is about understanding what they lost too late. It's about seeing love clearly only after it's gone. They don't usually reach out to fix things. Pride and fear hold them back. But inside, they replay the moments when they could have chosen differently. They may tell themselves that it wasn't meant to be, that it was inevitable. But somewhere in the quiet, they know that it wasn't fate that ended things. It was fear. And that knowledge lingers longer than the relationship ever did. Disconnection becomes the avoidance silent punishment, the invisible aftermath of losing someone who truly cared. When the relationship ends, they don't immediately feel the emptiness, they feel relief first. Relief from emotional demands, from vulnerability, from the closeness that made them uncomfortable. They tell themselves they needed this space, that they can finally breathe again. But the space they craved so badly starts to expand too far, turning from freedom into isolation. What once felt like control begins to feel like absence, and the distance that protected them starts to sting in ways they can't easily name. Avoidants are experts at distraction. After loss, they fill their time with activities, work, new goals, or fleeting connections. They convince themselves that staying busy means they're moving on. They might even find new relationships quickly, hoping to replicate the feeling of comfort without the emotional intensity. But it never feels the same. The conversations are lighter, the moments less meaningful. There's an invisible barrier between them and everyone else, a wall built out of fear, self-preservation, and unresolved pain. No matter how many people they meet or how much they achieve, nothing seems to reach the same depth as the connection they once had. This disconnection isn't just from others, it's from themselves. By avoiding emotional vulnerability, they also numb their ability to experience real joy or intimacy. They begin to live in a kind of emotional grayscale where everything feels muted. They can laugh, work, and socialize, but underneath it all is a quiet hollowness. It's not that they don't want connection, they do. It's that the closer someone gets, the more they fear being hurt again. So they keep people at a distance, mistaking safety for peace and independence for fulfillment. Over time, the emptiness grows harder to ignore. They might look around and realize that the very walls they built for protection have left them standing alone. There's no one to check in on them at the end of the day, no one who truly knows their fears or sees past their composure. They remember the person who cared, the one who noticed the small things, who listened without judgment, who loved without needing permission. And it hits them, they pushed away the one connection that felt genuine because they were too afraid to let it in. That realization carries a quiet ache that lingers long after the breakup has faded. Avoidants often try to fill this void with surface-level comfort. They might throw themselves into self-improvement, telling themselves they're bettering their lives, when really they're avoiding stillness, because stillness brings awareness. They might scroll endlessly, chase temporary excitement, or bury themselves in work just to keep from feeling the gap left behind. But emotional emptiness can't be fixed by external effort. The disconnection persists because it's not about what's happening around them, it's about what they're refusing to feel within. There's also a strange irony in how they experience connection afterward. Even when someone new shows genuine care, it feels uncomfortable. The gestures that once meant love now trigger resistance. Compliments feel invasive, affection feels overwhelming, and vulnerability feels like a trap. So they retreat again, convincing themselves that no one can really understand them. What they don't see is that the problem isn't a lack of love in the world, it's their inability to receive it. As time passes, the loneliness begins to weigh heavier. The noise of distraction fades, and they start to crave something real again. They might reach for connection but find it harder to create because disconnection has become their default. The emotional muscle that once allowed them to trust and open up has weakened. They begin to feel like outsiders in their own lives, surrounded by people but emotionally unavailable, wanted but unreachable. In rare moments of honesty, they might admit to themselves that they missed the depth they once had. Not just the person, but the version of themselves that existed in that love. The softer, more open version that felt safe enough to care. They may never say it out loud, but deep inside they know that disconnection was never protection. It was the quiet cost of losing the one who cared enough to see beyond their walls, and the hardest part is realizing that they built those walls themselves. For someone with avoidant tendencies, true healing doesn't begin in the silence or in the comfort of control. It begins when they finally face what they've spent so long running from. Ownership is the turning point. The moment when they stop blaming timing, circumstances, or the other person and start acknowledging the role their own fears played in the loss. It's not an easy process. Avoidants are used to intellectualizing their pain, explaining it away, turning emotion into logic. But healing requires something entirely different. It demands honesty, vulnerability, and the courage to feel what they've avoided. At first, they might resist this stage. They'll tell themselves they're fine, that the past doesn't matter anymore, that they've learned their lesson. But deep down, something still feels unresolved. They notice patterns repeating, the same emotional distance, the same failed attempts at connection, the same sense of emptiness no matter who they're with. Eventually, the pattern becomes too clear to ignore. They start to realize that the problem wasn't the people who tried to love them. It was their own inability to let that love in. That recognition stings because it forces them to confront the truth that much of their pain was self-inflicted. Ownership is painful because it removes the illusion of control. It means admitting that the walls they built for protection also kept out the very thing they wanted most: real connection. It means acknowledging that they pushed away someone who cared, not because that person was wrong for them, but because closeness made them uncomfortable. Avoidants often carry a deep fear of being abandoned or judged, and rather than risk rejection, they reject first. But when they begin to own that pattern, something inside them shifts. The defenses that once felt like armor start to look more like chains. Taking ownership doesn't mean drowning in guilt. It means taking responsibility for growth. It's the point where self-awareness replaces self-deception. They begin to see that love isn't dangerous. It's vulnerable, yes, but vulnerability isn't the same as weakness. They start to understand that strength isn't in control, it's in openness. Healing for them looks like small acts of courage, admitting when they miss someone, allowing themselves to feel sad without judging it, reaching out to a friend instead of isolating, or simply sitting with their emotions instead of burying them. It's in these quiet, uncomfortable moments that transformation begins. They start to see the value in emotional honesty, not just with others, but with themselves. They begin to connect the dots between their fear and their behavior, between their longing for love and their avoidance of it. Slowly, they stop idealizing independence as the ultimate goal and start to recognize that true peace comes from balance, being able to stand alone without needing to be alone. As they take ownership, their perspective on love begins to change. They stop viewing relationships as threats to their freedom and start seeing them as opportunities to grow. They realize that the one who truly cared wasn't trying to control them, but to meet them where they were. That realization often comes too late to fix the past, but it becomes the foundation for the future. It teaches them to value presence over distance, communication over silence, and connection over pride. Owning their pain also gives them empathy. They begin to understand how their avoidance affected the person who cared for them, how their silence may have felt like rejection, how their detachment may have caused confusion or hurt. This awareness doesn't just make them better partners, it makes them more human. It softens them. They start to realize that healing isn't about erasing their past or pretending it didn't happen. It's about learning from it, forgiving themselves, and opening their hearts again, even if it scares them. For the first time, they begin to see that real peace isn't found in avoidance. It's found in acceptance of their mistakes, their emotions, and their need for connection. They start to understand that love was never their enemy. Fear was. And when they finally take ownership of that, when they stop running and start feeling, they begin to move from self-protection to self-awareness, from loneliness to genuine peace. That's when healing truly begins, not in distance, but in the courage to let themselves be known. When an avoidant loses the one who truly cared, it isn't the absence of emotion that defines their pain, it's the delay of it. They don't fall apart in the beginning, they unravel slowly, quietly behind closed doors. Their journey is one of realization, not reaction. They learn, often too late, that love doesn't wait forever, and that control without connection is a hollow victory. What makes their story so human is that it's not about bad people or broken hearts, it's about fear. Fear of being seen, fear of needing someone, fear of losing the control that once felt like safety. But the truth is, love was never the danger, it was the mirror. It showed them what they were capable of feeling, what they were afraid to become, and what they stood to lose if they never opened up. Healing, for them, begins the moment they stop hiding from that truth. It's when they look back, not with pride or regret, but with understanding. When they admit that the person who cared wasn't asking for perfection, just presence. When they realize that vulnerability doesn't weaken love, it deepens it. That's when they finally begin to grow beyond avoidance and into awareness. So, if you've ever cared for someone who couldn't meet you halfway, know this. You didn't lose because you loved too deeply. You showed them what love looked like, and even if they couldn't accept it then, it will echo in them long after you've gone. And if you're the one who pushed love away, know that it's never too late to start choosing differently. You can't rewrite the past, but you can change how you love moving forward. Healing begins the moment you stop running from the parts of yourself that needed love the most. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for letting these words sink in. Whether you're healing from being the one who cared or the one who couldn't receive it, remember this: love isn't lost. It's waiting for you on the other side of understanding. Take care of your heart, keep it open, and trust that growth always follows awareness. Thank you for your time, your attention, and your willingness to feel. Until next time, take care, stay kind, and never stop choosing growth over fear.